Welcome back. Well, South Africa's economic recession for the first half of 2018 was spurred in large by a near 30% fall in agricultural contribution to expansion, particularly in that second quarter, 29.2% gone. But what do we attribute the fall in agricultural produce to? Agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo joins us now from our Pretoria studio. So let's chat to him. Wandile, thank you so much for your time. But let's get really a definition of what actually happened in that second quarter for us to see a near 30% fall in that figure.
Yeah, I mean, look, Rabile, your previous guests speak of confidence. That is important to agriculture as well. But I think at this time around, it's really the issue of nature, not so much of the policies that are busy conflicting in the sector as we speak. Look, what really happened is, as you know, the Western Cape has been under tough drought. And that we saw the impact of it on the first quarter numbers. But you remember that what we harvest or the output of that province does roll on largely on the first quarter, but a bit of it also rolls over to the second quarter. And I think that the tail end effects of that did play a part of that. And the other big part of the story is obviously what happens with the summer crops. Typically, you would have harvested a certain portion of your crops in the second quarter of each and every year, and then that you would see being reflected on the statistics. But this time around, the season started a bit late because of the delayed weather conditions. So with the harvest also then being a bit delayed, and then you do see that being reflected on the numbers, which is why, for example, in some of the statements that we put out on yesterday, we're saying we foresee a bit of a recovery on the third quarter, because we think that the fortunes that would have been calculated on the second quarter will somewhat come out on the third quarter numbers. So it's really nature at this time around.
So how much an improvement are you saying then we could get in that third quarter number?
No, I mean, look, I think we should be back in positive territory, but generally this year we were expecting that agriculture could somewhat perform around about positive 4% on a year-on-year basis. But obviously we will relook at those numbers, because yesterday's number, for example, our expectations were that there will be a negative contraction of about 19%. So the magnitude of yesterday was somewhat a little bit of a surprise. But when we really look closely at the numbers, maybe we missed a bit of a boat there, because as we saw the harvest being delayed as it comes on in the commercial silos, we somewhat maybe would have adjusted on that. So I would still believe that at the end of the year, we might end in positive territory in agriculture, assuming that the fourth quarter as well as the third quarter numbers will see a bit of a robust. And I really base that on some of the outputs that you see on grains, and also what is expected in other subsectors in the economy. You take, for example, soybeans. We're expecting a record harvest of about 1.6 million tons. You look at maize, we're expecting above average of about 13.8 million tons. So things are looking relatively better now. Any policy effect, I think that will start to appear over the coming year. But I think in the near term, really, it's just the weather-related issues that are at play.
Agriculture in itself, not so long ago, was seen to have been improving because the drought was sort of fizzling out. But that clearly seems to not be the case. Are we still in a drought, Wandile?
No, I mean, look, I think we are fizzling out. I think this is the context is Rabile. In the past couple of years, you look, for example, 2015 and 16, we were hit by the drought, but that was in the northern parts of the country, with the exception of the Western Cape. So we came out of that drought in the northern parts of the country, which is exactly what you saw boosting growth last year, double-digit numbers on the year. But obviously, the Western Cape, as we escape on the northern parts of the country, it fell on a drought side. Some people might ask to say, okay, if the Western Cape then was the drag on growth because of this drought, what happened last year? I think the key thing to remember there is the fact that the Western Cape output largely gets reflected on the first quarter, as well as somewhat slightly on the second quarter numbers, which is what brings the context to the numbers that we're seeing this year. So, and in terms, back to your question, as whether we are still on the drought, I think the Western Cape is somewhat slightly escaping that. I mean, you look at the dam levels, for example, right now, roughly around about 58% full, if you were to look at what was measured yesterday. So I think that we are somewhat getting better. Obviously, we are worried about the return of the drought if you look at next year, because forecasts are not that positive.
Yeah, particularly with regards to crops, you mentioned soybeans seeing a record crop. Anything else that we're expecting to see climb much higher? Maize as well, how's that faring?
No, I mean, look, on the maize side, obviously, typical year we would get on average about, 12.5 million tons. This year we're expecting around about 13.8 million tons. And on sunflower, also over 800,000 tons. It's above the average levels of just north of 700,000 tons. So we're looking at least relatively better. But all of this, which I'm explaining, is really the stuff of that was planted last year and is really being harvested now. And I think that the concern, if you were to look at the weather aspects which I've mentioned, the possibilities of another drought would potentially affect the crop that will be planted later on in this year. And I mean, you might have heard mentions be made of also the expropriation without compensation affecting growth. I think that is premature to judge it on the numbers that we are seeing now. Anything related to that policy would appear possibly in the numbers of the next year, because I think that it might affect plantings or investments as you go forward. But at this stage, there is no clear evidence to say, okay, this much has really been affected by this. I can't give you a figure on that, but certainly when I look at the confidence numbers, particularly AGBI's, IDC, GDP, it appears.
Yeah, well, he's a smart man dressed in blue, much the same as me. Thank you so much for that. Agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo. Zinga.